The wind was not a sound. It was a pressure. It was a solid thing, a white knife honing itself against the granite spine of the ridge. Elias felt it in his bones, a vibration that hummed up from the frozen earth and into the soles of his boots. He leaned into it, his body a low, stubborn bulwark against the screaming gale. Beside him, the horse, Copper, lowered his head, his powerful neck muscles straining as the first wave of ice-flecked snow hit them like a shotgun blast. They were caught a mile from shelter, with the sky falling in a solid sheet of white. "Come on, boy!" Elias roared, his voice stolen and shredded by the wind the moment it left his lips. He did not need the words. He grabbed a fistful of Copper's mane, the coarse hair a familiar anchor in the chaos. The horse responded instantly, his trust absolute. They moved together, a single entity fighting the storm. Elias knew this land, had mapped it in his mind during long patrols as a cavalry scout. But the blizzard was remaking the world second by second. Familiar landmarks vanished. The air grew thick, a blinding, suffocating curtain of white. Visibility dropped to the length of his own arm. He navigated by instinct, by the subtle slope of the ground beneath his feet. He knew the direction of the ridge, the one they called Miller's Ridge. He had to get to the south face, to the strange scar in the hillside that everyone in the town of Prospect Creek had laughed at for 6 months. They had called it Elias's Folly. He called it home. It was a desperate run. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and turning his beard to a mask of ice. Copper stumbled, his iron-shod hooves finding no purchase on the flash-frozen ground. Elias held him steady, murmuring assurances that were lost to the storm, but felt by the animal. They were a team. They had to be. Then, through the maelstrom, he saw it. Not a structure, but a subtle dip in the landscape, a place where the driving snow seemed to curl over a hidden edge. A dark shape, a heavy oak door set directly into the earth. They had made it. He fumbled with the iron latch, his fingers numb and clumsy. The door swung inward, not into a room, but into a deep, quiet darkness. He urged Copper inside, the great horse hesitating for only a second before plunging into the shelter. Elias followed, pulling the massive door shut against the raging storm. The world of sound vanished. The screaming wind became a distant, muffled roar, like a memory of a bad dream. The violent, bone-chilling cold was replaced by a profound, earthy stillness. They were safe. They were inside the Folly. 6 months earlier, the air in Sheriff Miller's office had been thick with the smell of stale coffee and sawdust. Elias stood before the sheriff's desk, a rolled-up piece of canvas held in his hand. He was a man made of leather and quiet confidence, his face a map of sun and wind from his years scouting in the high territories. Sheriff Miller, by contrast, was a man softened by town life, his authority resting in his badge and his comfortable belief in conventional wisdom. "I've filed my claim on the south face of the ridge," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "I'm here to register the build plan, as required." Miller leaned back in his chair, a look of bemused patience on his face. "All right, Elias. Let's see it. Another log cabin? Make sure you season your timber proper. Old man Hemlock built his green last year, and the chinkings already failed twice." Elias did not smile. He unrolled the canvas on the desk. It was not a plan for a cabin. It was a detailed drawing, a cross-section of the earth itself. It showed a long, deep excavation into the hillside, with thick, interlocking timber arches forming a curved roof. The roof was then shown covered by layers of sod, making it look like a natural part of the ridge. A low-profile stone chimney poked out of the top. Sheriff Miller stared at the drawing, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then amusement. He looked up at Elias. "What in God's name is this? Are you building a badger den?" "It's a house," Elias corrected him gently. "It uses the earth for insulation. It's called thermal mass. The ground holds a steady temperature, around 50 degrees, no matter what the weather does outside. A log cabin, it's just a wooden box. The wind finds every crack. You spend all winter fighting the cold that's already inside your walls." He pointed to the arched roof on the diagram. "This is the important part. A flat roof collects snow. The weight builds up. It gets wet, heavy. It breaks. I've seen it happen. This arch directs the weight down and out, into the earth. It gets stronger the more weight you put on it. You could pile 20 feet of snow on this roof, and it would hold." The sheriff chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Elias, people have been building cabins in these mountains for 100 years. I think we know how to build a house that stands. You're talking about living in a hole in the ground. I'm talking about living through a winter you've never seen," Elias replied, his voice still level. "You've had it easy the last few years. Mild storms. But I've been in the high passes when a real blizzard hits. Not a snowstorm, a proper blizzard. The wind comes down from the north like a hammer. It can drop 50 degrees in an hour. It can bury a 2-story house in a single night. A wooden box won't save you then. This will." Sheriff Miller picked up the canvas, holding it as if it were a child's drawing. He shook his head slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. "Elias's folly," he said, more to himself than to Elias. He stamped the permit with a dismissive thud. "Build your hole in the ground, Scout. Just don't be surprised when the spring thaw floods you out." The name stuck. Within a week, the whole town of Prospect Creek was talking about Elias's folly. It became a source of local amusement. Men at the saloon would joke about it. Women at the general store would whisper as he passed, shaking their heads. They saw him as a man unmoored from common sense, a strange hermit whose time in the wilderness had finally cracked his mind. Elias heard the whispers. He saw the pointed fingers and the pitying looks. It did not affect him. Their mockery was a language he did not speak. He spoke the language of wind, rock, and snow. He knew what was coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not the next, but it was coming. And he would be ready. The work began at dawn the next day. It was not work of grand gestures, but of relentless, methodical effort. He stood at the base of the ridge, the morning sun warming his back, and studied the slope. He had chosen the spot with a scout's precision. It was south-facing to catch the maximum winter sun. It was shielded from the prevailing north wind by the granite bulk of the ridge itself. A small, spring-fed creek ran nearby, providing a steady source of water. First came the excavation. This was the heart of the labor. He did not use much dynamite. The shock could destabilize the very earth he needed to trust. He used a pickaxe, a shovel, and the unyielding strength of his own body. The ground was a stubborn mix of soil and stone. He would swing the pick, the sharp point biting into the earth with a percussive chunk. Then the shovel, scooping the loosened dirt and rock onto a stone boat, a heavy wooden sled he'd built for the purpose. Copper, fitted with a harness, would then drag the loaded sled away, his muscles bunching as he pulled the weight clear of the worksite. They worked in a silent rhythm, man and horse, day after day. The townspeople would sometimes ride out to watch the spectacle. They'd sit on their horses at a distance, marveling at the sheer, brute stubbornness of the man. They saw a man digging a giant hole. Elias saw the shape of a home emerging from the land. He cut into the hillside a full 40 feet and 20 feet wide, carving a vast, rectangular cavern. He ensured the floor had a slight, almost imperceptible downward slope toward the front, a simple, effective guarantee against the flooding Sheriff Miller had predicted. Water would always find its own way out. With the main chamber hollowed out, he turned his attention to the foundation. He hauled stones from the creek bed, smooth, heavy granite rocks worn down by centuries of flowing water. He laid a dry stack foundation along the front and just inside the earthen walls, not to support a structure above, but to anchor the arches of the roof and provide a solid, level base. It was slow, patient work, fitting each stone against the next like pieces of a complex puzzle. Then came the timber. He went into the forest with his axe and a two-man saw, which he operated alone with a practiced, rhythmic pull and push. He selected lodgepole pines, straight and strong, felling them with an expert's eye. He and Copper dragged the massive logs back to the site. There, he began the most critical phase of the construction, shaping the great arches that would form the roof. He did not use nails or modern brackets. He used the old ways, the methods he'd seen in the high country used by men who built things to last forever. Using a draw knife and an adze, he stripped the bark and shaped each log. For the arches, he cut deep, interlocking mortise and tenon joints. Each piece was carved to fit perfectly into the next, creating a series of 5 massive, self-supporting ribs. Hoisting them into place was a monumental task. He used a simple but effective system of levers and a block and tackle rigged to an old oak tree that stood above the excavation. Slowly, painstakingly, one by one, the great wooden arches rose against the sky, their curved forms looking like the skeleton of some ancient, long-dead beast. He secured them at the base to the stone foundation and at the top to a central ridge beam. The frame was immensely strong, a testament to pure, practical engineering. Once the arches were in place, he laid thick planking over them, forming a solid, curved deck. Over this, he stretched heavy canvas, which he waterproofed with a thick coat of pine tar, boiled down over a fire until it was a black, sticky lacquer. This was his barrier against moisture. The final step was the insulation. He spent 2 weeks cutting thick squares of sod from the meadow below, rich with grass and tangled roots. He and Copper hauled them up the slope, and he laid them carefully over the tarred canvas, packing them tightly together. He started at the bottom and worked his way up, overlapping them like shingles. Within days, the roots began to knit together. By the time he was finished, the structure had vanished back into the landscape. It was no longer a construction site. It was simply a green hill with a sturdy oak door set into its face. Inside, the space was cavernous and cool. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine and damp earth. He built the chimney at the back, a masterpiece of stonework with a clever damper system to control the airflow. He built a separate, walled-off stall for Copper in one corner, with its own ventilation and access to a feed bin. The rest of the space was open. He built a bed into one wall, a long workbench, and sturdy shelves. The final months before winter were spent in preparation. He hunted, bringing back deer and elk, smoking the meat, and hanging it from the high rafters. He fished the creek for trout, salting them in a barrel. He laid in sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and sugar, and he cut wood. He felled dozens of deadfall pines, bucking them into rounds and splitting them with his axe. He stacked the firewood along the entire length of one interior wall. a massive reserve of heat and energy that reached from floor to ceiling. It was more than a stockpile. It was a promise of survival. As autumn deepened, the mockery from the town faded into a kind of quiet, dismissive pity. Elias's folly was complete, and he had retreated into it. He was now just the strange man who lived in the hill. He made infrequent trips to town for supplies he couldn't make or hunt himself. On one such trip in late October, he stood in the general store while Mr. Abernathy measured out 10 pounds of flour. 2 women were talking by the stove, their voices low but carrying in the quiet room. "It's a shame," one of them said. "He was a good scout, they say. To end up living like an animal in a burrow." "My boy asked me why he lives in a hole in the ground," the other replied. "I told him the man's mind got frozen from spending too much time alone in the mountains." Elias paid for his flour, nodded politely to Mr. Abernathy, and walked out. Their words were like stones dropped in a deep well. He heard the splash, but it did not touch him at the bottom. He was watching the world with a different set of eyes. He saw the signs they were missing. The squirrels were working with a frantic, desperate energy, their nests overflowing with pine cones. The geese had flown south a month earlier than usual. The sky, for the last week, had held a high, thin layer of milky white clouds that stole the warmth from the sun. The air itself felt different. It was thin and brittle. The day the blizzard came, a profound stillness fell over the valley. There was no wind, no birdsong. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Elias stood outside his door, watching the northern horizon. A dark line was forming, a bruise of deep purple and grey against the pale sky. Copper, standing beside him, grew restless. The horse stamped a hoof, his ears twitching, his nostrils flared as if he could smell the coming storm. Elias patted the horse's neck. "I know, boy," he murmured. "It's coming." He had been out checking his trap lines, a final preparation. He had lingered a little too long. The dark line on the horizon was moving toward them with an unnatural speed, swallowing the landscape. The temperature began to plummet. He could feel the warmth being sucked out of the air. That was when he knew they had to run. The stillness broke, and the first gust of wind hit them, the leading edge of the great storm. Inside the ridge house, the contrast was absolute. The chaos of the blizzard was gone. The only sound was the soft hiss of the lantern and the steady breathing of the horse in his stall. A deep, profound peace settled over Elias. He had built this place with his own hands, guided by memory and knowledge. He had traded mockery for security, convention for survival. He walked to the back of the dwelling and lit a fire in the stone hearth. The dry pine caught immediately, and a steady, radiant warmth began to fill the space. There was no draught. The chimney drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and out while the heat remained. He checked the temperature. Outside, it was likely 30 below zero and dropping, with a wind chill that would freeze exposed skin in seconds. Inside, the air was a stable 55 degrees and rising slowly with the fire. This was the genius of the earth. It was a giant, silent partner in his survival. He fed and watered Copper, who was now contentedly munching on hay, completely insulated from the life-threatening fury raging just a few feet above his head. Elias made himself a pot of coffee and cooked a thick slab of salted venison. He sat at his simple wooden table, eating slowly, listening to the muffled roar of the wind. It was a distant thing, an abstraction. The snow began to pile up on the roof. He knew this not from sound, but from a subtle, deepening silence. Each foot of snow was another layer of insulation, another blanket tucking him in, making the shelter even more secure. The arches did not creak. The timbers did not groan. The earth held. The arch held. He had been right. For 2 days he lived in his quiet, self-contained world. He slept, he ate, he tended to copper, he read a well-worn book of maps by lantern light. The storm was a constant, distant companion. On the 3rd day, he was carving a piece of wood when a new sound broke the stillness. It was faint, a scratching, thumping noise at the door. It was not the wind. He stood up, his senses on high alert. He walked to the heavy door and listened. He heard a voice, thin and desperate, almost carried away by the wind. "Please, help us." Elias unbarred the door and pulled it inward. A wall of swirling snow met him. 2 figures stumbled in, collapsing onto the earthen floor. They were crusted with ice, their faces raw and frostbitten. It was John Henderson and his young son, Thomas. Their homestead was half a mile down the valley. "Our roof! It came down!" John Henderson stammered through chattering teeth, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "The weight of the snow! It just snapped! We've been walking for hours!" Elias said nothing. He shut the door, sealing them back into the warmth. He helped the man and his boy out of their frozen coats, wrapping them in thick wool blankets he kept in a chest. He ladled hot broth from a pot on the hearth and gave it to them, telling them to drink it slowly. The boy, Thomas, looked around the cavernous room, at the high arched ceiling, the massive stack of wood, the calm horse in the corner. His eyes were full of wonder. "You live in a cave," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "He lives in the smartest house in the whole valley," his father corrected him, his voice thick with emotion as the warmth began to seep back into his frozen body. "The smartest house in the world." Later that day, another survivor arrived, a trapper named Silas, who had been caught on the trail. His lean-to had been obliterated by the wind. He had been drawn by the impossible sight of a thin, steady column of smoke rising from what looked like a snowdrift. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face a mask of awe. To him, in that moment, Elias's folly was not a folly at all. It was a miracle. The storm raged for a 4th day, and then a 5th. On the morning of the 6th day, Elias woke to a different kind of silence. The deep, muffled roar of the wind was gone. He opened the door and was met by a solid wall of white. The snow had buried his entrance completely. He took a shovel and began to dig. It took him an hour to carve a tunnel up and out into the new world. When he finally emerged, the sight stole his breath. The valley was gone. It had been transformed into a vast, rolling landscape of pure white, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts and dunes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The air was frigid and sharp as glass. Of the town of Prospect Creek, there was almost no sign. A few rooftops poked through the snow here and there, but most of the cabins were simply gone, buried. He saw the splintered remains of the Hendersons' home, a dark wound in the otherwise perfect blanket of white. He saw a thin, black plume of smoke rising in the distance. A house fire. A death sentence in this cold. The devastation was absolute, and the silence was the silence of a graveyard. Over the next few days, the survivors began to emerge. They were few. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and broken. They found their way to the only sign of life in the entire valley, the steady plume of smoke rising from the hill on Miller's Ridge. They gathered at Elias's home, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. They saw the Hendersons, safe and warm. They saw the trapper, alive. They saw Copper, healthy and calm. They stood inside the shelter that they had mocked, and they understood. On the third day after the storm, Sheriff Miller appeared. He was not wearing his badge. His face was gaunt, his hands wrapped in rags to cover the frostbite. He had survived by breaking into his own root cellar after the roof of his fine, conventional cabin had collapsed, killing his dog. He walked up to Elias, his eyes avoiding the scout's steady gaze. He looked around the warm, dry shelter, at the solid arches above, and the life they contained. He finally looked at Elias. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep humility. "You were right, Elias," he said, his voice quiet and raspy. "I was a fool. We were all of us fools. We laughed at you, and you were preparing. You knew." He shook his head slowly. "Can you teach us?" he asked, the question a plea. "Can you show us how to build like this?" Elias looked at the sheriff and at the small crowd of survivors huddled in his home. He saw no triumph in their faces, only loss and a desperate hope. He had not built this place for vindication. He had built it to survive. Gloating was a luxury for men with smaller concerns. "Yes," Elias said simply. "I can teach you." In the years that followed, the town of Prospect Creek was rebuilt. But it was not rebuilt in the same way. The new homes were not proud wooden boxes set against the landscape. They were integrated into it. They were built into the sides of hills with low profiles and heavy, sod-covered roofs. They were designed to work with the wind and the snow, not fight against it. Miller's Ridge became known as Elias's Ridge, and the house he built became a legend, a landmark that taught a fundamental lesson in survival. It was used as a community shelter in the lesser storms that followed, a permanent haven built from the wisdom of a man who listened to the earth instead of the crowd. Elias never became the mayor or a man of official standing. That was not his way. But he became something more important, a teacher. He shared his knowledge freely, showing people how to read the land, how to cut the joints, how to build a home that would hold against the worst the world could throw at it. His vindication was not in their apology, but in the quiet competence of the homes that rose from the valley floor, each one a testament to the lesson he had taught them. The folly on the hill became the foundation of their future. It served as a stark, living reminder that true wisdom is often quiet, and that the crowd is almost always walking in the wrong direction. It proved that preparation is not an act of fear, but the highest form of understanding. Sometimes, the only thing that looks like madness is a foresight so profound that the present world cannot yet comprehend its logic. Long after Elias was gone, and long after his faithful horse, Copper, was laid to rest on the hill, the ridge house remained. The grass on its roof grew thick and green in the summers, a gentle slope where children would play, never knowing they were running across the top of the very structure that had saved their grandparents. The house became a part of the land itself, a quiet, permanent monument to the scout who knew that the safest place to be in a storm was not standing against it, but nestled deep within the arms of the earth itself.